Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. My name is Alan Fadling, and I invite you to listen to leadership conversations that will help you to develop healthy rhythms of rest and work, and to live fuller in friendship with God. I hope this podcast will help you to overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 202 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Each week on the podcast, we have leadership conversations to help us lead better in the spirit of Jesus' unhurried way, the way of leadership that flows from a full soul instead of an empty one. Sometimes I'm talking with fellow authors, and sometimes I'm talking with leaders just like you who are learning to live and lead at the fruitful pace of grace and peace. Today, I'm sharing a recent conversation I had with Sister Joan Chittister about her latest book, The Monastic Heart. Sister Joan has been a guest on Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul Sunday, as well as many other popular programs. She is an internationally known author and lecturer, and the executive director of Benetvision, a resource and research center for contemporary spirituality. She is past president of the Conference of American Benedictine Prioresses and the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Her books include The Gift of Years, The Breath of the Soul, Called to Question, and Following the Path. She's a member of the Benedictine Sisters of Erie, Pennsylvania. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, please follow, rate, and review. And be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Let me say that when Sister Joan and I had our conversation, she was in Ireland in a remote area and in the midst of a heavy rainstorm. And so there were many points at which our Zoom connection froze. Now, we've done the best we can to capture everything we could from a really great interaction, but there may be a few moments at which you'll notice there's an odd break in her thought. Now, we've done our best to give you all the goodness Sister Joan shared. And at some point, Sister Joan decided to give me a new name, Corey. So I guess it could be my monastic name, huh? Anyway, with all that said, let's dive into my conversation with Sister Joan Chittister. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Sister Joan Chittister to talk about her latest book, The Monastic Heart. Thank you so much, Sister Joan, for joining us for this conversation.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. The thing I love about radio, and I do, is that you have substance. We have time for a real conversation instead of a script. So let's go.
I love that so much. I really do enjoy that too. And I would love to start our conversation just by asking if you could tell a little bit of the story of how you came to write this particular book at this particular time.
I'll tell you the truth. That I don't even have to say that. I mean, if I say it, it's verbatim, and it's come from. You're the only one who's been brave enough to ask me directly.
Okay. Well, here it comes.
So here comes the truth. It's 25 years ago, and a friend of mine and I go out for lunch together. I call her my muse. She's a published poet. And so she comes at every subject, from the inside out. And I come to every subject from the outside in. I want to know everything, the context. I want to know everything about it. She takes one look at it, intuits what it is, stays up all night writing a poem, right?
Oh my.
So we're out for lunch and we're talking, and she's always been, literally, I mean it when I say I call her my muse. She comes up with these ideas that she thinks I should do. She shouldn't do. I'm a poet. You're right. Okay. So at lunch, we're talking about regular stuff, all the stuff that has gone through the office and in this little publication center that we have. And all of a sudden, I can tell she's restless. She just doesn't want to talk about that stuff anymore. So she says to me, I know you're gonna do those things, but what you have to do, Joan, you have to do a book that explains the dailiness of monasticism to people. We use all these words, statio, metanoia, all the lovely words, and they come to the monastery and they love the community, but they don't know what we're doing with those things. I said, "Oh, come on, Mary Lou. What are you talking about? I don't want to do a book on a Benedictine glossary. Are you?" She said, "No, it wouldn't be a glossary if you did it in the first place, but in the second place, you have to help people understand this. They pass places, they say there's a monastery, and then they say, what's that? You have to tell." So I said, and how do you think I'm going to do this? So she said, well, I thought we could make a list of Benedictine words. And if you would explain those things to people, they would understand it and they would know a lot more. I said, oh, good, Benedictine words. So I said, all right, do you have a piece of paper? So we sit down and we tell one another 25 Benedictine words and off we go. I say, well, that's off my back. We did it. I wrote the words. That's all I'm doing. I'm not doing that book. So it is 25 years later, about a year ago, and we're out someplace and we're talking about possible topics. And she said, when are you going to do that book that I want you to do? And I said, what book? She said, that one we talked. I said, in that restaurant 25 years ago? She said, yeah, I brought it. She's got a folder in her hand. She brings out this piece of paper. The first 25. I said to myself, I can't believe this woman. So I said, you're serious about this? She said, I think you're the only one who can do it. Who else is going to do it that way? You'll tell them stories. You'll tell them the truth. And at the same time, you'll tell them what it's about and how we do it and how other people did it. Wow. You have a piece of paper? Okay, 25 more words. She is sitting in Erie, Pennsylvania right now. The book is coming out on the 21st. Nobody's happier than she is. And you know what, Mary? I'll tell you the truth. The woman was right. I began to write this book, and I suddenly found myself telling myself that this is probably the clearest spirituality of the Benedictine life or mindset that I have ever done. And it's full of me and Marty and 1,500 years ago. What happened 1,500 years ago that is still happening today? Can you argue with that? Can you if you know that something has lasted 1,500 years in this society where we can't promise you that the bank will be open for 6, can you really tell me that somebody shouldn't be saying, what does this crowd have that enables them to go through era after era after era of history and survive them all? How'd that happen?
It's amazing.
You asked, Corey, and that's how this book got written.
I'm glad I asked. I love that story. I love that it's had a chance, maybe invisibly, to just sort of gestate in you, and that at just the right moment, here it came.
And it is the right moment. Yeah. That's the second part, you see. I got up one morning in the middle of COVID and asked myself, what do people do at a time like this? And came to the conclusion that the society was frail, was fragile, has gone from certainty to faith. We used to know exactly what the day was like and what we'd do tomorrow and where we'd go and why we would do it. And now all of a sudden somebody took this big eraser and just went, no. I knew there was only one answer, and that was endure it. And we're still in it. It's not over by a long shot. Endurance is the wet cement that our feet are in every single day.
I was first introduced to your writings probably about 20 years ago when I read Wisdom Distilled from the Daily, which, of course, there you're unpacking the rule of Benedict in particular ways. I wonder if you could just talk to our listeners, some of whom who may not have been exposed to monasteries or retreats at monasteries, just kind of a few words about what monasticism is.
Emerges in a culture in decline. It's the 5th century, late 5th century. Rome is collapsing. It hasn't been acknowledged yet, but all of the colonies are overtaxed. They can't squeeze anything else out of them, and they can't pay to keep the legions there. So this phenomenal state of public, civic, and institutional, let alone empirical decline, a young man from a village up on a mountain in Norcia comes down to Rome to go to school, which would be like the Chicago or the Harvard or the Stanford of the age, right? And when he gets to Rome, he recognizes this phenomenal sense of wasted souls. I mean, just eruptions and corruptions everywhere. He's 19 years old, and he says to himself, there's nothing here. And he leaves Rome. He leaves his studies. He doesn't stay. He goes home, and he takes about 3 years to decide what he learned in seeing this. Remember that. He looked at where he was and asked himself what it was about, what was wrong with it, and what needed to be done. And at the end of that time, he had also begun to, the shepherds of the area found him, and they were asking questions. These guys all were podcasters, and they've got these questions coming at Benedict over and over again. And he's teaching because he's a natural teacher, and he's thought it all through. And so the shepherds say to him, you get out of this cave and you come and teach the other people like you did us. Beautiful moment, because he was ready to settle down and do nothing. They said, you can't do that with what you have. You get out and do it. So he left the cave, and his decision was this, that there was no way to conquer Rome. There was no, this is a group without arms. There's no way to compete with Rome. They don't have the resources, and they can't possibly handle the notion of empire, and he doesn't want an empire. But what they can do, he decides, is we can live a new way in an old shell. We'll create new world in the shell of the old. We won't compete with them at all. We won't talk about them. We won't criticize them. We won't be negative in any way. But we are all going to live differently. If you want to live with me, we're about to live newly. We're going to create this new society right here. He knew what he was doing. And he takes what is now a little book about 5 inches high and 4 inches wide, and has 72 tiny, tiny little chapters in it. And that is the book that I was professed holding my hand with 1,500 years later.
Wow. Same
rule. Why? Because it's not a rule in the Western military sense. It's a guide. It's a rope to hang on to. It's a fence to lean against. It's a regla. And so he says he doesn't have rules. What he has are values. He teaches values. And that's where I would tell everybody in any kind of doldrums at this moment in our society, in our culture, sit down and ask yourself what your values, what are your 3 to 5 most important values? Tell me how you're living them now. You say, I love entertainment. I love music. Fine. good. Get out the old guitar and start practicing. Buy a couple of CDs of great opera. Refresh your soul yourself. Don't sit in that big fat chair and wait for somebody to come by and tell you how to be happy. You know how to be happy. If music is it, if family is it, you call your mother every Monday and Thursday night at 7:00, and you make family for yourself. And yes, you will know what to say because she'll get used to telling you everything she wants you to know. If your spiritual life is one of your values, then you forgive me. I this is not my language, but I don't know how to say it now. You find a book like that says to you, you could light a candle in your room. You could talk to the neighbors. You could make a frittata and take it to that old lady down the street. You could find a way to be happy yourself by making happiness for others. That movement into a conscious living of good things on my own schedule. Yes, I'm working from home. I've got 2 kids, one pulling the hair of the dog and the other one crawling around my ankles. How am I supposed to do anything? Take the hour and a half those kids need. Play with them, then put them down for a while and go back to your work. You'll work better. And the kids will settle down. Structure these things so that, because that's, you see, what the monastic does. The monastic takes a 24-hour day and puts 5 things in it every single day. So when you say, tell me about this thing, the monastic. The monastic is not, they're immersed in Scripture. They're open to everybody. We're supposed to be peacemaking centers. We don't ask for your credentials, racial, sexual, international, religious. If you've come to our house, if you've come to that monastery, you are automatically guest and you are automatically taken.
I love that answer. I appreciate your helping us see a sort of a vision for what it would look like, maybe in our experience, to practice our values, to do something in the spirit of what matters most to us that God's given us. Now, in the book, as you said, there are 50 chapters, sort of 50 words or practices there. And we don't have time to unpack 50 of them, but I wanted to touch just a few. And one of them, I was really drawn to this. You said the practice of statio, that you describe it as giving our whole selves to the present moment. I love that phrase. Can you say more about that?
Well, I'll tell you the story about that first. I was a kid and I entered the novitiate, the monastery, 16 years old. And I loved the nuns for years, and I always knew I was going to be one. So now had come the big moment. And I entered with 5 other young women. And the novice mistress was telling us the ropes, showing us how to get through the day. And she said, now, prayer is at 5:00, and you must be there 5 minutes before. What? Wait a minute. Something I didn't hear here. Prayer is at 5:00. That's prayer. Yes, sister, that is. But I have to be there 5 minutes before it is? She said, absolutely. And I said, when am I late? Am I late at 1 minute after 5 or at 1 minute after 50? She said, you will be in your pew in chapel at 5 to 5. I thought to myself, these people are mad. They don't even know what to do. I mean, they're nice people and all, but they tell you what time a thing is. And then they say to you, no, that's not the time. The time is 5 minutes before. It took years Years, and then I got it. Stotzi says, do not race through the door, run down the front hall, throw your coat off on the bench, drop your briefcase, and come sliding into chapel. It says you go to chapel 5 minutes ahead of time. You hang up your coat, you put down your briefcase, you leave your papers on the bench, and you sit and you say to yourself, no, I'm not going to think back. I am here now. I will think here now about this now and about what we're about to do now. That's what I'll do. That's statio. That's collect the self in order to be the best and wholest self possible. Know where you are, know why you should be there, know what it's about, and do it. And you will find it will change your life. It will change the way you live. It will dampen the flurry. It will stop the nonsense. And it will say to you, now this minute is for you.
What I love about the way you've unpacked that, of course, the name of this podcast is Unhurried Living. And the spirit of that is that we're talking about is Jesus is as beautifully unhurried as any person has ever been. His ability to be fully present in every moment with each person. What you've just described as statio sounds to my ear is exactly the spirit of what we're trying to talk about here.
Well, I'll tell you, Corey, when I saw the name on this, and when Penguin Random House called me and they said, would I be willing to talk? Of course, yes, of course I would. And to know that I was talking to people from other denominations, I was just over the moon. That was exactly the way this should be. So it wasn't going to be, excuse me for this, but one of those very empty secular approaches from people who haven't been in the church in 30 years and say to me, I really don't know anything about what you are. Could you tell me some questions to ask? That has happened.
I can imagine.
Then I saw the name of your podcast and I said to myself, oh my God, I hope this isn't a group that thinks that the spiritual life is something that we just waste time with God. We just kind of float through life, no responsibilities and no concerns. Jesus was the coolest person you'll ever know, and Scripture is very clear about it. He needed a rest. Let's take the boat and go over to the other side of the lake so we can relax a little. And then the evangelist says, and by the time he crowd was already there, he was living life to the ultimate, but at the same time, he was everywhere he was.
Yeah.
He wasn't looking at his watch every 15 minutes saying, well, Corey, this has been very nice. And I'm really happy that I met you, but I'll have to run now. No, what you're talking about is so necessary to the centering of the soul. Just stop. Just take 5 minutes in the room before anybody says, this group shall now come to order. Just be there. Know what you're doing, why you're doing that. And then listen to what everybody else says. Listen. And, if you listen enough, you're going to learn a lot more than you want to.
I appreciate that. So as you talk about some of these practices, there are a number. At one point, you talk about, just the practices of solitude and silence. And we don't live in a world where there are many opportunities to be alone and quiet fruitfully. I wonder if you could just speak to that invitation for people who are listening.
Oh, that's really the central pillar of the monastic life. And you have to remember now that monasticism is a very heavy running river in all major traditions. The Buddhists have monastics, the Hindus have monastics, the Jews have monastics, the Islam has monastics. I mean, this is something that wells up out of the spirit, right? So you're going to find a lot of solitude in all of those places. Why? Because solitude is a vacation for the soul. It's the time that you never get. You say, I got to think about that someday, and you never go back to it. I have this little notebook where I hear something really important and I put it down, and 17 days later I say, what in God's name was that? Now that means that's my sign to know I didn't have enough solitude after that note that I was free to really think about it. Solitude is where you go to allow yourself the freedom to answer the unanswerables, your own unanswerables, as in, why did I snap at her today? Or why did I not remember my books? Why did I just leave them there? Or why didn't I ever ask my mother about this? And where do I find that kind of family answer if that's nagging at you? That's solitude. And silence, on the other hand, is what leads you to find your questions and to follow them. Silence shapes us. It takes us out of the chaos, and it allows us to think other thoughts, and silence grows us because we're hearing other things, we're seeing other things. We're taking time to look at that mountain with all the boulders and ask ourselves, what do they do with those boulders? How did they get them down that hill? Was it slave labor? Was it the first technology? Do they still do it that way? Did they say, let well enough alone? Those are all highly philosophical answers, and they deserve your silence to think about it. It will make us one with our lives. Silence makes us one with our own lives.
That is a beautiful word.
Well, you say to you sit down in that chair that night, in the silence of your little library, and you say, who is that Joan Chittister? Does she really mean those things? Do those things really happen? She said something today that really, I have to think about that.
Yes.
I'm not sure what she meant.
I appreciate that. I just think a lot of our listeners, as you said, many of us have very busy, very full schedules, but we're just not present enough in all of those moments. So we're not as attentive to the reality of God with us in those moments. And as I hear you talk about solitude and silence, this is that way in which we train ourselves for that kind of attentive, available, loving presence.
Yes, it is. And to be available to the people you love. Be with them in silence and not nag them and ask them 15 questions about your day when they're too tired to answer once of them. You can just, look out the same window. And when you feel like talking, you can answer those things about the boulders if you want to.
Yeah. So one of the other practices I was particularly drawn to that I thought would intersect with our audience, you write about the practice of holy leisure. And one of the themes we talk about a lot in this podcast is God's invitation to find rest for our souls in Him. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this monastic practice of holy leisure.
Yes, thank you for picking it, because it either never gets picked because it doesn't make any sense to people, or they have interpreted it. Holy leisure is not play. It is not a synonym for play at all. Holy leisure is a moment of reflection in which we ask ourselves, how in this situation could I have responded in a more profitable way to my congregation, to my students, to my family. Let's put it this way: the shorthand is at the end of the answer, and this is my definition. Holy leisure is that moment at which we ask ourselves, coming up the steps of the underground in New York City or Chicago, why is it that people are sleeping in the metro? That's a gospel question.
Yeah.
That's a powerful moral question. And only the person with a soul of stained glass will do it. And they will only do it if they take solitude for those moments at which they are waiting for something to spring up in them. That is another dimension of the Spirit in their lives. Why, in the richest country in the world, are people sleeping in the metro? There are thousands and thousands of those questions. Why is it that in the richest country in the world, we are losing whales? They are dying on our beaches. And is that important? Who loves a whale? Everybody who understands the fishing industry and fisheries and what fish do for us and what is happening to our water and how did those tin cans get in that whale's stomach to begin with? So this is holy leisure is what leads us, if we use it correctly, to embed ourselves in life with the gospel in one hand and a pitchforks in the other. So doing something about it. And even if it's only alerting the kids, your children at the dinner table. Do you not know, Terry, that the whales are dying? I want you to find out this week, why are whales dying and what will be the effect of that? Then you come back to supper next Tuesday, and we're going to have, while you have your hamburger, we're going to talk about whales and why they're dying and what that has to do to your faith. Terry, I want you to be a good, holy person when you grow up, and it's got something to do with that whale. Now go find out what it is.
So it's the leisure to ask the questions that matter, to see things as they are. It sounds like to be able to respond in the Spirit of God and in the love of God in tangible, measurable, practical ways.
In real ways. I have become quite fond of saying this. I remember when I said it the first time, and I saw the shock on people's faces. And talk about a moment of solitude and holy leisure. Leaving that hall, I said to myself, I was talking about Genesis. What shocked them? I'll tell you what it is. Someplace in the middle of the presentation, I looked at the audience and I said, yes, there is a God. And yes, God created the world. But here's what you have forgotten. Though God created the world, God did not complete the world. That God left up to us. And we are making a drastic mess of it.
Oh, boy. That's a profound insight.
It is not to believe in the Creator. It is to do the rest of the work that the Creator gave to us. Loved us so much, trusted us so much, was so sure of our responsibility. And then we do nothing. How do I know we've done nothing? Because we are on the brink of losing this creation because we're not saving it.
That's so critical. So as I've been enjoying your book, I've been finding moments and points at which I can step in and take action. And so I'm wondering, as someone picks up your book and begins to read it, there's 50 practices. Maybe they won't want to start trying 50 practices all at once on day one. But if you were to just give some spiritual counsel about how to start in on the book, how to lean into it, how to begin to take action, what counsel might you give?
Oh, well, my counsel is pretty clear about that kind of stuff. Every chapter is short, and every chapter is divided into two parts. Where this idea came from and how it might be integrated into our own lives now. Read that book with a pencil in your hand.
Yes.
Everything that bothers you, everything that moves you, if there is anything, everything you say, I got to remember that. You circle that, you put the X out in the margin, you write a thing and you say, this woman's out of her mind, or down here, such stupidity. I don't care what you write, but do it. Use the book. And then maybe read that same chapter every night for 5 nights. They're short. You can do it in 10 minutes.
That's true.
Ask yourself at the end of that 5-day reading of the very same thing, what did I get out of it? What's that saying to me and my life? Just me and my life, not her book. Not what is her book saying? What impact has that seeded in my soul? You write the rest of the book. You write the rest of the chapter. You just stretch it and stretch it. And when you get to something pretty cute like metanoia, and you say, what in heaven's name is this mess? Say, when at the end of it, say, I still don't understand it, or wow. Metanoia is what this culture called, what'd you call that? A midlife crisis.
Oh, there you go.
And everybody has one.
Yes.
But you have to figure out how to get through it. And you have to know that it's natural, that it works that way. And you have to know that it was in a very abrupt call of consciousness from the mind of God, and you got it. Those two rays came together and you got it. And you said, oh my God, if I've been doing that all my life, I got to look into this. I got to talk to somebody about this. It is transformation at the deepest possible level. Most effective pastor in that part of the country that they'd ever had a kid, and he must have had just about all the religion he could take for a while. So he got to the point where he bought himself a cheap Harley and he took off. He's about 19 or 20 years old, and he just crossed the country. And he went from one casino and one cheap bar and one even cheaper motel to another, probably for almost a year and a half, just running around the country. And one morning, in the cheapest hotel in town, motel, he opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling and said, what in the name of God am I doing here? How did I get here? What was wrong with me? And he said, he got up, he had almost no clothes. He threw them in a duffel bag. He went out, packed them on the back of the thing, and got on and drove all the way back to what I call his prodigal father. You know, the father who has nothing to say except, welcome home, son. I've been missing. Love you. And he went in and he said to his dad, Dad, I just want to tell you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for. You learned plenty. We all learn different ways. You're doing fine. And 5 years later, that young man went to the seminary. They gave him a parish, probably the worst decision they'd ever made in their lives. But he decided that parish work really wasn't his, but turned himself into a producer of educational religious material at the time when it was just beginning to hit televisions, that you could do a lot of education that way, and has fed more parishes in the country than people would ever think. And he tells me all the time, it was my metanoia, Joan. I just crashed. And when I got all the way to the end of the crash, I went back to the only place I knew that had been good for me. And that was, and I didn't know what my dad was going to do when you wanted to go, just stay gone. We don't need you here. No. So they both I would argue the father had a bit of a crash himself, and they put together, and it became two whole people. And if we don't go through it, you can die at some level, in some way. You can die a pretty empty shell.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I as we come to the close, so thank you for giving us some practical advice about how to engage this book that you've written. I'm already enjoying the chapters. I'm looking forward to returning to a few that seem to particularly hit home for me.
So, I would not expect a man like you to read the book. You have a fine education and a big heart, and you've done great work, and I know you're busy. But thank you for dipping into it, and thank you for being able to read it for a while.
Absolutely. Well, could I ask if you would, just to share a word of encouragement or blessing for our listeners as we close our conversation?
Indeed, I will.
Thanks.
And first, dear God, see the heart of this good man and hold him up in it. You know what it's like to be in the middle of the on your own mind. But give him the strength to understand that the questions that are hard are the ones his people and his listeners need most. Share them, trust them. Never, ever substitute certainty for uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to faith, and faith leads to blessing, and blessing leads to God, and God will lead us all to wholeness. This we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Well, Sister Joan, thank you for being my guest today. We've been talking about her new book, The Monastic Heart. Thank you again for taking time for this conversation, Sister Joan.
Well, dear, thank you for taking the time to have it.
I was so encouraged by Sister Joan's simple, practical, deep wisdom. You know when someone has lived truth well, when they can make things so very easily understandable. And when we talked about the practice of statio, it was fun to hear Sister Joan interact with a common misunderstanding of what we mean by unhurried living. It isn't detached leisure for people with lots of resources. It isn't laziness that disregards the deep needs of the world around us. It is slowing inside to the pace of presence. It's being able to be where you are rather than being half there or less. And I hope you'll go back and listen again to her extended description of what monasticism is. Basically, that it's a structuring of your life to actually live out your deepest values. We don't settle for just believing in the values of God's kingdom. We don't stop at arguing about or defending the great commandment of Christ. We live these things with intention and regularity. I really do hope you'll join me in reading The Monastic Heart and allowing God to guide your spiritual practices through the good things Sister Joan shares in it. Now, in the 3 remaining episodes of this season before our late December and January break, we'll be talking with authors like Brian Zahn, and I'll share conversations with leaders like you on topics of slowing to the pace of love and the difference between working for God and working with God. I can't wait to share those with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried Daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.